Okay, folks, we ran lecture one on Victorian attitudes toward women as reflected in some literature, particularly George Eliot's fiction. We're going to be there again for part of lecture two on Victorian women. And this little lecture, Sex, the Double Standard, and Victorian Hypocrisy. And we are going to get our full measure from our scarlet flower here at the beginning on. So let's start by stepping right back into George Eliot and Adam Bede and think about Hetty in your assigned portions of Adam Bede. Eliot, right from the beginning, the initial description is condemnatory of Hetty. Hetty Sorrel, rather childlike. Well, after all, she's a 17-year-old, but we've got the other things that she's just got this fondness for baubles and pretty things. She's lazier than a farm girl should be. A good farm girl is practical, ambitious, and ugly. Well, yes, ugly, okay. But Hetty is pretty, likes pretty things, wants the the life of upper class as she envisions it, which is a pretty empty little piece of it, but it's fancy lace and stuff like that, and she just loves the idea. She is, in her fashion, her childlike fashion, manipulative toward men. She likes male attention. Oh, these are all nasty. Right. Bullshit. Oh, well. And then Arthur Donnithorne, who is going to be the other half of this mess, our young man out of the gentry, baronet. And yes, he is, surprisingly, painted far less negatively from the start. He's well-intentioned, definitely irresponsible, but he wants to be a nice person, and he's drawn toward pretty young women. Well, all young men of a heterosexual disposition are drawn to pretty young women. That kind of works that way. So this is okay. But he's also eyeing those not of his social class at a time when there is absolutely no opportunity to marry outside of one's social class. To dabble and exploit outside of one's social class is a male privilege, though, or at least it's one that was exercised. Eliot's not going to tell us this is a good thing. She doesn't. But she's not very negative. Yes, he seduces Hetty, and this is a bad thing. But while Eliot's not excusing him, it's still kind of underplayed. She suggests he made a mistake and ought to know better, and he's been told not to. But what young man doesn't make a mistake? Oh dear. He does seem to care about his own behavior. Well, gee, he's being damned irresponsible here, but he does care about his own behavior. He cares about Hetty, well, at least enough to feel guilty and try to get her sentence reduced at the end after she strangles her baby. And he cares about his community so that after all of this mess, he quietly leaves so that his best tenant won't run off and the community won't go on to rack. He does a bit of self-sacrifice there because some men of his social class would just go on mistreating their tenants as they pleased and not give a damn about it. He doesn't do that. So Arthur is treated gently. As for Hetty, Hetty going to be treated gently? No, this 17-year-old who is emotionally younger than 17 and has no experience of the world, she's held fully responsible because she got herself pregnant. I've never figured out how a woman manages to get herself pregnant other than by artificial insemination, but then that's a different problem there. She kills her child in just desperation. Those things happened. And as the net result of this, she's transported to the colonies, gets sick there, and dies. And this is expiation, and this is what has to happen to a young woman. And for forgiveness, she has to die. It's in the rules with most of these fiction writers. Get the one exception in a moment. And Arthur, who should have known better, he's a mature young adult. He's in his mid-20s. Well, he's blamed for his bad judgment. But Arthur's not going to up and die. No, he's going to show up at the end of the book years later, older and wiser, having suffered a bit, and all this stuff. Oh, yes. Men get away with it. Suffer a bit and go on, right? Yeah. So this gives us that Victorian message in a nutshell. A woman who has sex outside of marriage is fallen, irrevocably damaged. She should die remorseful in our standard Victorian novel. She's an object of scorn in Victorian society. Meantime, the man who has sex outside of marriage is doing what males do. He's rather easily forgiven, or at least he is forgiven, and rather easily, definitely easily ignored. Now, Dickens would be a little bit of an exception to that, as he nods to Victorian conventions and then uses them, twists them to draw empathy, sympathy for some of his characters. So little Emily, who is seduced by Steerforth in David Copperfield, well, she doesn't suffer disgrace or die. Her uncle manages to find her, retrieve her before she commits suicide, and takes her off to Australia, where she's not known, to start a new life. It's all okay. Lady Dedlock, who does end up committing suicide indirectly, kills herself by exposure or in the cold, well, the message she doesn't receive from Lord Dedlock is all is forgiven. Now, Dickens is willing to forgive. The culture that he is in, is it willing to forgive? Eliot doesn't sound like she is. And we have to wait a little bit, get on in the century just a bit, before a couple of the pre-Raphaelite writers, Christina Rossetti and her brother Dante Gabriel Rossetti, will both say otherwise. You've got notes, extensive ones on canvas on both poems that should explain things. I want to reiterate my central point on them, so that's why this is in the oral lecture. And first one, Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, places the blame exactly where it belongs. The blame for fallen women, the blame for Victorian prostitution. It was epidemic. Some of the more extreme statistics say that 1 in 4 women at one time or more had sex for money in that Victorian era. I think that number is too high, but whatever, it was very, very substantial. So, why do women do these things? Starvation. There are no good jobs for women in this Victorian world, so if you're single and not marriageable with family and all the rest of that, if you're from the poorer class, it's going to be very rough. So, hunger. Then there are all of these temptations of the London streets. You have worked yourself to exhaustion. You're in millinery or doing sewing, piecework pay. If you can get the money for it, there are opiates to kill the pain. And there's cheap gin. There. There are men. You've heard the word pimp, I think, folks. Men recruiting prostitutes. And men buying the prostitute's wares. The buyer, if he buys from a John, or if he is seducing the young woman, or buys from a pimp, or if he is seducing the young woman, is just as guilty as the pimp. What are the women? Victims. Victims of economics, victims of seduction, victims who are regaled with the pretty fruits. And no, they are not eternally fallen. Rossetti wrote the poem to some fallen women, that is, to folks in a kind of Victorian halfway house, something rather like that, where Rossetti volunteered. She writes it to them, telling them salvation is possible, telling them to listen because there is no friend like a sister. It is a woman, a sister, who carries salvation. Salvation from the Catholic Christina Rossetti comes from the feminine manifestations of the deity's act. It's where you find gentleness, mercy, and forgiveness. It's like the model of the Virgin Mary. It's like a Pre-Raphaelite painting done of a Christ knocking on the door, carrying a message of forgiveness, a particularly gentle image of Christ, and both models for that painting. That was one of Malais's pictures, I think. You can do a double check on that. It's in the notes, or you can look it up. But the light of the world, the models for that, well, the Christ figure was modeled for by two women. Elizabeth Siddell, who was Dante Gabriel Rossetti's his model, mistress, and later wife, and Christina Rossetti. So, no friend like a sister. And then Dante Gabriel Rossetti's poem, Ginny. Ginny's a prostitute, narrator a young man who spent the night with her. Well, note he's not very judgmental toward his own behavior. Yes, it's done, but it's nature. He cares about her. He's genuinely affectionate and such as that. He was not ruffianly. He doesn't misbehave in that fashion. He's a gentleman, paid her properly, and such as that. But now, if his behavior is acceptable, how about hers as a prostitute? And his words there, and here is the substance of his rumination. Yes, yes, she likes the same things as his innocent cousin Nell, fun and money. She needs the money, the alternative, poverty, starvation. Her motives are just as pure or just as impure as his, no more, no less. Thus, Rossetti's narrator is placing the blame, well, not as much on Victorian men as a gender like his sister did, but on Victorian mores and morals, the deeply hypocritical stance of the Victorian world, that this woman should be considered dishonorable for being no different than his cousin Nell, except that Ginny has sex for money, she needs to or does, that they should be considered one for honor, one for dishonor, makes a goblin of the sun. What's he saying? Victorian moral judgments are evil. The economic forces that push women into prostitution are evil, and the hypocritical attitudes of men who would visit prostitutes and then revile them are evil. It's that last that's the big deal. Those attitudes are evil. Narrator, let's admit it, he fails to see his own behavior as exploitative, and it is. He's taking advantage of the system. He doesn't seem to quite catch that. But he's an honest man and wants nothing more than an honest transaction. So, welcome to the Victorian double standard, or well, not welcome, we joined it earlier. Welcome to its full manifestation, full hypocritical manifestation. From Eliot's Adam Bede, we see, oh my. Yes, I don't think Eliot saw it, or she didn't behave as though she saw it in her writing. We see that Victorian double standard and that it is what destroyed Hetty Sorrel. Dickens sees the exploitative and judgmental nature of Victorian society. Mentioned that a minute ago. Now, Goblin Men, which we are looking at, levels blame. It points. Christina Rossetti does not play around about it. Men seduce women. Men use women. Men use them until they wither and die. And her brother, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, his Jenny, shows us that damnable hypocrisy of Victorian sexual mores. Whatever his weaknesses, Rossetti's narrator possesses the empathy to suggest to us, in fact, to tell us with it makes a goblin of the sun, to tell us that Jenny is as worthy as any of us. This poem did not make Rossetti popular with a certain variety of Victorian critics, as they were, shall we say, disturbed by him and every manifestation of what was called the fleshly school of poetry. Well, tough. We're human beings. If sex is good, Jenny is innocent. If virtue is good, then it is the exploiters, the pimps, the sellers of opiates and gin who are evil. And Victorian society carries this, deep current of evil within its mores and morals. And when you look at those two Rossetti poems together, I think they say that rather solidly.